Hey everyone. So forgive me as I make this video. I'm just getting over a cold, and so my voice may be a little weird, I know. But just bear with me. We'll make it through, and I should be better by the time this video is up. Anyway, I just wanted to make this light video here, discussing what I think are some of the best advanced works of Lutheran thought, because a lot of people know the more common works of Lutheranism, or the more popular level works, but they don't necessarily have much experience with the more in-depth stuff, and I think this would be a good video to discuss that kind of material. Of course, I'm going to be covering a few books that I think are very valuable, and implicit in all of this is that you read the scriptures. I mean, that should be a given, but I have to say it nonetheless, in case anybody attacks me for not mentioning the Bible. Well, there you go. Anyway, the first book that I highly recommend is going to be the Book of Concord. To be honest, I'm surprised by how many Lutherans I know that haven't read the Book of Concord, because it is what we have to confess. It's what we hold a quia subscription to, or at least all confessional Lutherans hold a quia subscription to. And it's actually pretty in-depth material. It's very good for understanding what Lutheran thought is, and it's very useful for learning Lutheran doctrine over and over and over again. What's nice about the Book of Concord, and also annoying at the same time, is just how repetitive it is. It's very repetitive insofar as you'll get multiple different treatises talking about the same subjects. There are several treatises that talk about, say, baptism, or the free will of man, and such. And it can be a little bit annoying if you've learned about those enough, but for newcomers and people who just want to reinforce their understanding of theology, it's very helpful because you get to hear it over and over and over again. It's just kind of drilled into you. It's really good in that respect. And I think it's also pretty underrated in terms of polemics. It's pretty great, especially in the Apology and in the Formula of Concord, where it's responding to pretty serious errors in a much stronger way than simply saying this is what we affirm and this is what we deny. It actually makes some pretty solid arguments that, upon rereading, I'd forgotten about. So I highly recommend the Book of Concord for anybody, of course, but anybody who wants to understand Lutheran theology, this is a must-read. Must-read. Now, second, and this isn't necessarily in a particular order after the Book of Concord, but just what I have in mind is actually going to be On the Nature of Scripture and Theology by Johan Gerhart. Of course, I recommend pretty much anything by Johan Gerhart. That should be obvious. Gerhart is phenomenal, even though he's a little dry. But On the Nature of Scripture and Theology is especially helpful because it's a kind of almost a prolegomena of sorts as to how we approach the scriptures and why we have the scriptures that we do. And it's also a really good set of responses to, say, traditions that, or theological traditions that say that we need the church to define the scriptures for us. That's something that we'll see pretty often coming out of Rome and out of the East. So it's pretty helpful in responding to that, but it's also very useful in understanding what exactly our theology of scripture is, what scripture does, where it comes from, how it was assembled, and so on. It's very long. It's admittedly a very long work, but it's pretty great. There is some odd stuff in there that Gerhard does where he talks about some stuff from the Hebrew that kind of goes over my head, but I've heard that it's pretty wacky. But to be honest with you, other than that, I know it's phenomenal, and some people may even agree with what he says there. So regardless, it's good. Next is going to be pretty similar. It's going to be the examination of the Council of Trent. I especially recommend Volume 1. Now, of course, Volumes 2 through 4 are also really good, but Volume 1, I think, covers some of the most interesting topics, or at least the most important ones that honestly, everybody that is not Roman Catholic or Eastern Orthodox should know about, specifically justification, sola scriptura, and such. It's very good at saying pretty much the same things that Gerhard does on the Nature of Theology and Scripture, regarding Scripture and tradition. Chemnitz's use of 8 different types of traditions is actually really, really helpful, and Cameron pretty much used that in his debate as well, and it's really interesting and gives a really sobering understanding of what tradition is and how we can use it. So I recommend that highly as well. Volume 2 is also very good, covers a lot about the sacraments and the nature of the Mass and such, so I recommend that. Honestly, the only thing that can be annoying with this book, with the examen, is that sometimes it's really hard to track down Chemnitz's citations, because sometimes he'll just say, Gregory says this, and he won't necessarily cite where, And so it's like, well, I can't find it because sometimes that work is either untranslated or frankly, we just don't have access to it anymore. And to be fair, he frequently does actually give citations as to where things are. But again, sometimes those are untranslated or perhaps he had a forgery or something like that. But usually that's not the case. So just got to be careful. And that's something that we see permeate throughout all of the Middle Ages. Sadly, even the Book of Concord falls into citing Ambrose as the author of The Call of All Nations, and Gerhart does that frequently too. Now, next is going to be pretty similar. It's going to be Chemnitz's Loci Theologicae, or Loci, or Loci Theologici, however you want to pronounce it. I know that it's kind of debated as to how you should pronounce it, but regardless, it's going to be Chemnitz's commentary and expansion on Melanchthon's Loci. It's pretty great, actually. It's a little dry, but it's very helpful because it put things out very systematically and in a way that I think a lot of people need, because frankly, a lot of Lutheran theology is written in a very polemical way. A lot of it is specifically written against Rome or against the Reformed, and it's pretty nice to have something from Chemnitz that's just straightforward, not necessarily specifically directed in response to anybody, but directed to just put out positive statements. And of course, it does get polemical, but it still is very helpful to have it as a set of positive statements in the first place, or that's its primary goal. Now, next is going to be one that people probably aren't really aware of. Basically, it's a book called The Holy Trinity. It's by Carl Beckwith. It's put out as part of Confessional Lutheran Dogmatics series, and it's really good. I have not found another book on this topic that's as high quality as what Beckwith puts out. So I've read some phenomenal works on the Trinity, of course, from Church Fathers, specifically Augustine's work on the Trinity and some of Tertullian's stuff where he responds to the modalists. I actually really appreciate his Against Praxeas specifically. But Beckwith is really good because he goes through and he actually goes specifically the Lutheran distinctives on the doctrine of the Trinity, which admittedly are kind of few and far between, not because Lutherans don't put anything out on the Trinity or we don't have Trinitarian theology, but more so that we're just thoroughly pretty Western. And so we're not going to say, hey, we immensely disagree with, say, Thomas Aquinas or Duns Scotus or just the Western tradition broadly. It's more so that we're just not going to make really sweeping statements as to say that the Franciscan view or the Dominican view is necessary or anything like that. What is interesting, though, what I really appreciate is actually his discussion of the Filioque. That's very, very helpful. I hadn't run into something as thorough from a Lutheran author, and I really appreciate it. It's also pretty cheap on Amazon. If you get it for Kindle, I got it for something like $10, so I recommend that. And then finally getting into some more modern works as well. I mean, Beckwith's work was modern, but these books aren't as advanced, but they're modern, and I think they're still very helpful. Is going to be Brian Wolfmueller's Has American Christianity Failed? I've obviously been using that for my series where I'm addressing evangelicalism, but what I find that's so useful about it is that even though it's not super in-depth or super intense, it's still phenomenal. It really is, because when you address evangelicalism, and this isn't meant to be an insult towards evangelicalism, I'm not trying to call them shallow or simple or anything like that, but I think what's interesting about evangelicalism is that you don't necessarily have to use a bunch of really complex statements to respond. You don't have to go through, say, the formal causes or the four causes. You don't have to go through, okay, well, here's the formal cause of this or the material cause of that. You don't have to really do that when you talk with evangelicals. And Wolfmueller's just very good about it. And of course, evangelicalism is just hard to define. As I've said before, it's hard to say this is what evangelicalism is with a very broad brush. But Wolfmueller does kind of fall into that, because some evangelicals would read his statements and say, well, I never believed this, or I was never taught this. But for the most part, he's right. So I highly recommend that as well, because it really helps people understand what the comparison is between American Christianity or American evangelical Christianity and Lutheranism. It was something very helpful for me as somebody that was converting out of Lutheran or out of American Christianity, because it doesn't just say this is what Lutheran theology is. It says this is what American evangelicalism says, and this is what Lutheranism says. And it really compares and contrasts them in a very, very good way. And I think it's interesting because it goes through a lot of the psychological effects of American evangelicalism too. That's something that's highly underrated in theology as well. And it's something that I haven't really seen as much in, say, the scholastics. So this is something I really appreciate. Now, to be fair, our Lutheran theologians, of course, do talk about the conscience a lot. I will say that. But Wolfmueller is just so direct about it, and he talks about it so much that it's something I really appreciate, and I think most readers would appreciate as well. Now, next is actually a book that's pretty similar. It's called Wittenberg versus Geneva. And I am going to be a little biased here. It was actually written by my pastor when I lived in California. So obviously I may be biased with my review here, but actually I've run into a lot of people online who've said that this book is really helpful for them. Now, it's basically a work that it's kind of like Wolfmueller's Has American Christianity Failed, but it's not as harsh, I suppose. And it's very good because it addresses modern Reformed thought, specifically Presbyterian thought. And that's not to say that it's meant to be super exhaustive. It doesn't cover absolutely everything. If you really wanted to get into responses to Reformed theology or comparisons between Reformed and Lutheran theology, you're going to have to go into a lot of other works for that. But it's still a good introduction, and I think it's helpful for a lot of people, both Reformed and Lutheran, for understanding where our differences lie. With all that being said, there are going to be a lot of other works that I'll recommend. Some dogmatics texts. I mean, I enjoyed Pieper's Dogmatics, as dry as it is, and I wish he did a lot more with patristic analysis. I also would recommend pretty much, as I mentioned, anything from Chemnitz, also some stuff from Nicholas Hunius as well. Hopefully we can get some more of his stuff translated or in print. I actually have with me right now a copy of, I think it's pronounced Diaskepsis Theologica, and it's pretty much out of print. I can't find it anywhere. God bless, I have access to it through a church library. But if you can get your hands on it, it's pretty good because it goes through a lot of what we would call secondary and primary issues and covers what exactly the distinction is there and how exactly that affects faith. So overall, at the end of this video, what I want to say is that there are a lot of good works out there, but sometimes it's just hard to find them, both in terms of print and also just in terms of good recommendations, because Lutheran theology isn't, say, like other theological systems where you have a bunch of guys writing stuff now that's super accessible. And a lot of our best works are going to be pretty expensive, but I hope that this guides you all in the right way. So to recap, what I mentioned was Book of Concord, which free online, but it's also nice to have a good paper copy. Carl Beckwith's The Holy Trinity, which you could get on Kindle. I got it for like $8. On the Nature of Scripture and Theology by Gerhart. That one's going to be pretty expensive. And then Examination of the Council of Trent, also expensive. Loci Theologicae, again, expensive. But then Wolfmueller's Has American Christianity Failed, and Brian Thomas's Wittenberg versus Geneva. And all of this alongside other scholastic works. So if you guys ever have questions as to what you specifically should read for, say, a specific topic, just comment below and I can try to answer that as best I can, or one of the other channel owners will try to answer that. But to be honest, I had to go through this journey of discovering what to read kind of on my own for a little bit. And eventually I found a bunch of good works and I just want to share them all with you. So I hope you have a nice week and I hope to interact with any questions you have.